Good afternoon. Welcome into Unpaid Interns. We are live on the IU Sports Media YouTube and Twitter pages for our final episode of the week. And of course, we are previewing the massive matchup tomorrow, the first top 10 matchup, in fact, in Indiana football history, is the Indiana Hoosiers. Number 9 in the country travel to take on the number 3 Ohio State Buckeyes. We've got a great guest to preview the matchup. Zach Osterman, the Indiana athletics beat reporter for the IndyStar, joins us today. Zach, how you doing?
Hey, how are you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm doing great. You know, you've been covering this IU team and IU athletics for a long time. You know, you've been around Kevin Wilson era, Tom Allen era. Did you expect, I guess, going into this season, a season anything like this?
It's interesting because I got that question from Galen Clavio, of all people, this morning. And I think certainly not when you thought what you thought, right, about Michigan and Penn State. And, of course, obviously Ohio State. But if you could have told me, if you could have somehow reached into the future and sort of said, this is actually the level that some of these teams that maybe the preseason expectations are high when they shouldn't be, or when they will prove to be kind of misplaced. This is the actual level. I would have said, I think Indiana could beat those teams then, because even going back to the bowl game last year and coming out of the bowl game last year, you knew that unless things just went terribly wrong in the offseason, Indiana was going to be a good football team. They're deep, they're experienced, they're talented, they're balanced. Especially after last season, you can tell there's clear buy-in to what Tom Allen, from those players to what Tom Allen is, kind of trying to get them to do and get them to believe in particular. And so, it was, I even think back to just my general preseason predictions. I think I had Indiana at maybe 4-4, and Vegas had, I think, over under of 5.5 on wins. So Vegas was trying to get you to buy on Indiana at least going 5-4. I think that might have been 5-3. I think those numbers would have been not counting the 9th game. But, my only real rationale for that was just that I thought some of the opponents Indiana would have would just be very difficult to start, especially with, Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State, and Ohio State all in the first 5 games. But we've seen the way Indiana has come through that, and I think it's just been a testament. Just quite frankly, I think Indiana's better than those teams. I don't think these are upsets anymore, and obviously the Michigan State game in particular, not in the eyes of the odds makers was it an upset. Indiana's just better than those teams right now, and so if you can say that, and this is what Galen and I were talking about. People say, well, you can only say that with the benefit of hindsight, and it's like, well, yeah, that's just kind of how the world works. Like, I think the comparison I made was, you don't say I'm not going to eat my lunch because I just don't know how it's going to end at the end. And once I know, it won't be, it won't be filling anymore. With the benefit of seeing what we've seen, I don't think anyone should be surprised, because I just think Indiana's better than the teams they've beaten. Now, are they better than Ohio State? No, probably not. And that's going to create a whole new set of challenges. But I think they are certainly better than the teams they've beaten, and they're good value for being 4-0.
That's a great point. It's been interesting this week leading up to this game. I was on Twitter this morning, saw multiple national writers who had written articles about Indiana football going into this game. What is just the exposure and the attention on, what might be the biggest game of the Big Ten football season do for this Indiana program?
Well, I think there's a lot of layers to that. I mean, I think one of the things that has happened just more generally this season is that Indiana football has been part of the national discussion, in a way that it really never even was last year. I think the only time that I can think of that wins and losses in my time around the program, maybe dating back to like 2005 when I was in college, the only time I think results have really put Indiana in that conversation would have been 2007. And that was, of course, revolving around the story of, that team playing for Terry Hepner, who had passed away that summer, and getting to 7-5 to win a bowl game. Because it's worth, people don't remember this now, but that team probably needed that dramatic win against Purdue to be sure of going to a bowl. At the time, there weren't as many bowls as there are now, and being 6-6 may have gotten them in, may not have. But I think that, the difference is this team is it's just purely about the results on the field. And I think that, it's you wonder how it'll impact recruiting. I don't know that I don't think it'll impact this class very much, but one thing you're always selling at Indiana is, hey, if you want to play the big boys, we play Ohio State, we play Penn State, we play Michigan every single year. You're going to get these stages. Well, if you start not just being able to say you're going to get the stage of playing in the big house or hosting, ranked Penn State in a big game, whatever, but starting to be able to say, and we're going to win those games, that's when it kind of goes up a level. And I think that, it's not quite apples to apples, but I think that applies in staffing as well. Obviously, I think it applies in, fan support. We saw a real sort of groundswell of fan support last season. And of course, you would imagine that coming out of this, whenever fans can be back in stadiums, there will be a strong reaction to this as well. But I just think that, I think it's this is a weird cliche to lean on, but in my mind, like college football programs are kind of like sharks. They have to keep moving or they die. And so you're always moving forward or moving back. And I think that for Indiana, the key now is to just sort of say, how do we make sure that we're continuing to move forward? Even if you lose this weekend, there's no shame in that. But, how do you take this season and once it's over, once it's packaged and done, wherever and however it ends, how do you take this season and make sure that it is pushing you forward to something new or whatever is next?
One more big picture question for you before we get into some of the specifics of the game tomorrow. It's an Indiana football history, not with a lot of success. I mentioned in the first top 10 matchup ever in regular season history. The only top 10 matchup Indiana football has ever played was the 1967 Rose Bowl against USC. Is tomorrow the biggest game in Indiana football history since that 1967 game?
No, I think you'd have to go back to 87. They went to Michigan State. I want to say it was the penultimate game of that season. And that was a Michigan State team that would go on to win the Rose Bowl. I think it was the first time in like 6 or 7 years the Big Ten had won the Rose Bowl. So it was a big deal. And, they played a Purdue team. They were playing a Purdue team that last game of the season that finished 3-7, 3-7-1. I got the schedule up here now. That finished the season 3-7-1. And so they would have been, they were at home. They were guaranteed to be favorites. And this was the year that they beat Michigan and Ohio State both in the same season. And if they had beaten Michigan State, that was almost a de facto Big Ten championship game because Michigan State would have been 7-1 in the conference, or at that time, I guess 5-1-1 in the conference, and Indiana would have been 6-1. They would have been right there with Iowa, which would have had the tiebreaker. But Indiana, if you assume they would have beaten Purdue, they would have won the Big Ten and gone to the Rose Bowl that year. But of course they didn't. In fact, it wasn't even very close. They lost 27-3 up in East Lansing. So I think it's certainly the biggest game since then. You could obviously go back to the Purdue game in 67, and it is the first time in program history that Indiana has played a regular season game where both teams are ranked in the top 10. So obviously the stakes and the interest and the excitement are all relatively foreign to this program. But I would say 87 probably has, especially because that was kind of the, that was undeniably one of the high water marks of Bill Mallory's tenure. He kind of had two phases, the first initial build and then a bit of a dip and then a second real kind of rise in the early 90s. And that was probably the culmination of that was his fourth season. And either that season or the next season when they went on to win the Liberty Bowl. It was one of those two. It was kind of the real sort of peak of that first kind of wave in Mallory's era. And, I think that there are actually maybe some comparisons between, that game and the one Indiana approaches now. Obviously, Michigan State was very good back then. That was the George Perlis era. Like I said, that was the Michigan State team that would go on to win, finish top 10, win the Rose Bowl. Like I said, they were one of the first. They were the first Big Ten team in like 6 or 7 years to win the Rose Bowl, so it was kind of a big deal. And I think that really you're probably talking about a pretty direct comparison between that game and this game, obviously the difference being without fans.
Interesting stuff. Let's get a little bit more into the game in Columbus tomorrow, and we'll start with the Indiana offense. A little bit inconsistent the last few games. Great game against Michigan, so against Michigan State. Probably their toughest test now on Saturday against the Buckeye defense. What do you think they need to do to have success against the Buckeyes?
Well, I think offensively, the first thing is Indiana's got to play the cleaner game. I don't think they can go in and make mistakes and win. I think offensively, you got to get Michael Penix going, and that sounds simplistic, but I suspect you're going to have to do it without a run game. And you're probably going to have to do it with, some quick passes, some timing routes, some screens, some really well executed stuff, kind of right at the snap on the perimeter. Because, especially if Caleb Jones can't play, you're probably looking at the offensive line, defensive line matchup and being a little concerned. But we saw, we saw Michael Penix do that against Michigan. The first 6 plays of that game were passes. I think entering the fourth quarter of that game, I think Indiana had thrown 49 passes to 21 rush attempts. So, it's in a couple of those, at least one of those rush attempts, I think was a sack. So it's possible. We've seen Michael Penix do that before. We've seen Indiana do that before with Michael Penix, but I think that's a big key. And then the other one I would throw out is, Indiana's got to get Ohio State off center. They got to get Ohio State making some mistakes. Do you maybe get a little bit of luck in Ohio State being rusty coming into this week? They obviously just played 2 weeks ago, they played kind of a soft pedal game against Rutgers. Last week, of course, they were off unexpectedly because of Maryland's issues with COVID-19. If Ohio State's rusty at all, Indiana's got to take advantage early, force some turnovers, win the field position battle, create scoring opportunities for an offense that's already scored 51 points off turnovers this season. I think it's not going to be easy, but it's also not. I think the one big difference is it's not a situation like it's been at times in the past where you say, well, yeah, Indiana can beat Ohio State if everything goes right for Indiana and everything goes wrong for Ohio State. I don't think that's the case. I think Ohio State can win some of these matchups and Indiana still win the game. But I think that Indiana's strengths, which are, kind of disruption through aggressiveness on defense, and then, of course, Michael Penix's ability to marshal the passing game on offense, have to shine through if Indiana is going to have a chance in this game.
You mentioned the rushing attack, thinking Indiana might not be able to run the football a lot. They just haven't very much this year, 12th in the Big Ten rushing attack, offensive line injuries as well. Is that something you think could help Indiana? Can they establish a run game, or are they just too banged up on the offensive line?
I think it's actually more schematic. I don't think Indiana doesn't want to run the football, but, Tom Allen has never finished. He's never had an offense finish better than 9th in the conference in yards per game, rushing yards per game. And he's obviously had 3 different coordinators, but they've all kind of run the same system. And it's all always felt a little bit sort of based around what he saw Hugh Freeze do at Lambeth and Arkansas State and Ole Miss. And I just think that I think there's a good chance that Indiana just would rather sort of win this game, through the air. And, I think Indiana would rather win this game, using the passing attack almost like a running game. We saw a little bit more of this last season. We have this season, the swing game, the screen game, the perimeter sort of passing game. Maybe you bring a little bit more of that back in. It's been interesting to watch Indiana kind of incorporate more pre-snap motion into its offense the last couple of weeks without really using it a lot. And it's interesting because sometimes you do that as window dressing. Sometimes you do that because you're preparing to introduce some wrinkle, and you're almost maybe saving it for an Ohio State if you feel like you can, that you think can throw an opponent off. And I think Stevie Scott will always be a key piece of this offense. I don't think anybody doubts that. And I think that there are things that Stevie Scott does well that help make this offense work, including the fact that nearly all of his carries gain yardage. Even if it's only a couple yards, it still just sets you up in a more manageable down and distance deeper into the drive. I think he's gotten a lot better in pass pro. He's, obviously incredibly important when you're dealing with short yardage and red zone situations. So I think it's just, again, it's, if Indiana's tearing off big yardage on the ground, they'll keep going to it. But I don't think it's an offense where they're sitting around and thinking we just absolutely need to make this work for us on the ground or we have no chance to win the game. I'm just not sure the offense is structured that way.
I guess is there concern that you become so one-dimensional that Ohio State maybe, only rushes 3 and sits its linebackers back and kind of forcing Michael Penix to throw into those tight windows if you're not running the football much?
Well, first of all, I think if Ohio State starts rushing 3, I think Indiana will run the ball and they'll just start ripping off 3, 4, 5 yards carry. Second of all, it's more complicated than that in theory. If you say you're going to drop 8 into coverage, then Indiana will say, well, we'll just go to our screen game, and we'll just, because let's say it's more like 4, because I think that would be more likely Ohio State runs an even front. So let's say Ohio State says, well, we're going to throw an extra defensive back on the field, and we're basically just going to play you nickel. We're going to drop our linebackers into coverage. We'll play some zone over the middle just to protect against crossing routes, whatever. Well, then Indiana will say, we're going to overload one side of the field and start throwing those screen passes that were so good to us last year. And we'll just start eating, ground up that way. We can throw them to Watt Fillier. We can throw them to Ty Freifogel. We can throw them to David Ellis. We can throw them to Peyton Hendershot. We can give you all sorts of different looks. And so then Ohio State will have to, and I'm just playing this out, from a schematic perspective, then Ohio State says, well, we're going to have to flex these linebackers out and kind of get them closer to the perimeter to prevent those and to stop us from getting overloaded. And then Indiana says, well, we've got 5-on-4 in the box here, and now we'll run the football. And maybe we'll bring, Peyton Hendershot in motion, we've seen some of that kind of crash down backside trap motion from Henderson this year. Then all of a sudden it's 6-on-4 in the box. So I think it's, listen, if Ohio State can control the line of scrimmage with 4, that's how Michigan beat Indiana last season. Was they were just whipping Indiana up front, even though they were only bringing 4. And that allowed them to drop 7 into coverage. That allowed them to blanket both sidelines and still be in Peyton Ramsey's face all the time. And lo and behold, Indiana just kind of runs out of steam and Michigan wins the game. But number one, I think Indiana is better than it was a year ago. And number two, I'm not sure that, especially with Michael Penix's quick release, because I think that's one of the biggest differences between Penix and Ramsey. People talk about the arm strength, and I get that, but I think the bigger difference is Penix can release the ball so quickly that he can give himself that extra half second against the rush to let somebody get open, and then he can deliver the pass and still be confident of delivering it forcefully and accurately. So it's all the chess game, but I think that, if Ohio State just went to a place where they were just blanket dropping 8, then Indiana would just start running the ball. And if they started dropping 7, then Indiana would start to say, okay, well, where can we move the ball around that we're still getting? We know Indiana's not afraid to give Watt Fillier 16, 17 catches in a game. And even if those 16, 17 catches don't go for more than 150 yards, then Watt Fillier still acts like a running back to you at that point. You're effectively building a run game into your pass offense. So, again, it's all kind of the chess match. But I think Indiana's got the versatility to address a lot of issues as they come up.
It's going to be an interesting game of cat and mouse on the offense for Indiana. And on the other side, I think many people looking forward to seeing the Indiana defense against Justin Fields and maybe the best offense in the country in Ohio State. Much has been made of Fields' 11 incompletions, 11 touchdowns, maybe the favorite to win the Heisman Trophy. Kane Womack, he's been great this season, dialing up pressures and just having great game plans to disrupt opposing quarterbacks. What do you see him trying to do to be really the first team to bother Justin Fields this year?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have to be aggressive. I think the key with Indiana is you can change some things up. You would imagine, especially after how vanilla Indiana was a season ago. I think that you can certainly imagine that they've got some wrinkles to throw at Fields and Ohio State. I do think you're going to have to be yourself along the baseline, which is be aggressive, trust your corners, especially when you kind of bring 5 or 6, like 6, you're playing pretty much man coverage across the board. Trust your cover guys to be able to manage that, to be able to handle that. Respect that you're going to give up some yards. You're not going to dominate Ohio State. What you've got to do is be prepared to take advantage of opportunities when the opportunities arise. And I think that's kind of where Indiana is for me, is, stay true to what you want to be and what you want to do, which is be an aggressive downhill blitzing team that doesn't pass up too many opportunities for big plays, be it sacks, penalties, turnovers, whatever. Because, any and every one is going to prove, when you're trying to win a game like this, any and every one is going to prove crucially important.
Is that a concern for Indiana? I mean, it was interesting. They've been, I guess, a bend not break defense in many ways. They're actually 4th worst in the Big Ten at giving up plays 20-plus yards or more, and the only 3 teams worse, Michigan, Illinois, and Rutgers, not known for good secondaries. Can Indiana rely on turnovers, rely on giving up yards but not breaking, or is that not going to work against, a really dynamic offense?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that stat, and I think that's fair to a point, but I'd point out that Indiana is as many plays away from 5th in the conference in plays at 20-plus yards as they are 11th, and then you go to plays at 10-plus yards, and Indiana's 5th. They're tied for 5th, and the only 2 or 3 of the 4 teams ahead of them have only played 3 games, and Wisconsin's only played 2 games. Actually, what I would argue is, what I would contend is that Indiana has gotten a lot better against explosive plays. And I think the important distinction is they've gotten a lot better against explosive plays, in particular against the run. And it's not to say that they don't give up some long rushing plays, but Indiana teams of the past that really struggled defensively, as much as you talked about, big passing performances and things like that, what would kill Indiana defenses is a team would have the ability to, just tear off maybe 35 yards on 3 runs. And when that happens, you just blow up a defensive game plan for a drive, because that forces you to shift everything around. But of course, you got to do it in real time, especially with spread offenses, hurry up offenses. You're talking about shifting personnel around. You're suddenly asking guys to completely change discipline. And again, kind of going back to the stat you cited, Indiana's tied for 2nd in the conference, having allowed just 3 rushing plays of 20-plus yards this season. If you look at the 10-plus yard number, and I know that different people define explosive plays on the ground versus through the air in different ways, but they're tied for 6th in plays of 10-plus yards. And once again, they're tied for 5th. And 6th. And 3 of the 5 teams ahead of them have not played 4 full games yet. So Indiana's given up some big yards through the air. And that's going to happen, to be fair, when you're playing man coverage, because sometimes you just get beat one-on-one. But by the same token, Indiana's also got, leads the conference with 10 interceptions. When you talk about, just like where kind of teams have been able to hurt Indiana, Indiana is one of the better teams in the conference in opponent completion percentage. Opponents are completing under 59% of their passes against Indiana. And we've even seen, I think that the biggest passing performance of the season to date against IU, of course, was Joe Milton. And Joe Milton throws for, I think, 344, and I want to say either 2 or 3 touchdowns that day. But he also throws 2 interceptions when Michigan hadn't committed a single turnover to that point in the season. And he takes 3 sacks. And, the sequence that basically kills the game goes holding penalty, sack, interception. And so I think this has always kind of been the defense that Tom Allen envisioned in a way, frankly. Allen is, even thinking back to his first days on the job at Bloomington, he was always a head coach, or he's always a defensive coordinator, I should say, that was at peace with the idea that in modern football, you're going to give up some yards, and you're probably even going to give up some points. The game has gone too far in that direction. But it's, can you create the change plays that shift momentum, that give your opponent your offense, short fields, that allow you to command time of possession. And again, these are all areas where Indiana has actually been very, very good. You talk about total defense. I think they're 4th in the league. They're 4th in the league in points per game. They're not even allowing 20 points a game. And again, they're getting a whole different animal this week. I think everybody understands that. But at the same time, it's a defense that, when you say opportunistic, sometimes what that means is basically just that a defense doesn't have a lot going for it. And so what it tries to do is just blitz and grab interceptions. That's a little bit of the way Indiana's defense was that 2007 season when they went 7-5 and went to the Inside Bowl. This defense is opportunistic because it plays good disciplined football. It stays sharp to its keys, and the different levels of the defense complement one another. The question is, what is the highest level we've seen this defense operate at so far this season, and how far is that from where it needs to be if it's going to have a significant game against Ohio State?
We've talked a little about Ohio State. Indiana's actually kept it close a lot of the recent matchups against the Buckeyes, though definitely not last year. They lost 51-10 in Bloomington. How do you see this Ohio State team just compared talent-wise to teams of the last 5 or so years in the Ryan Day and Urban Meyer era in Columbus?
I think it's all the way up there. I don't know if this Ohio State team is quite as good as last year's team, just across the board. I don't know if Master Teague is as good as J.K. Dobbins. I don't know if you've got a Chase Young, but I do think there's a very real possibility you've got the best quarterback in college football, maybe the best player in college football, period. And Justin Fields, I think he's at a different level than he even was last year when he was inarguably the best quarterback in the conference. I think you've still got some really good pieces, Wilson and Olave at wide receiver. You're never going to doubt what Ohio State's got on the offensive line or the defensive line, at least in just sort of a structural way. I think the big thing for Ohio State, and listen, we've seen them play 3 games, and for all that's made of the lack of competitiveness and that Indiana's gotten from its opponents, Ohio State's not like Ohio State's played any big time games yet either. The one thing for Ohio State is they don't feel so kind of airtight as they have done in the past. You think about that Rutgers game as an example. They go up big in that game, and then things just kind of, listen, they still win comfortably, but Rutgers gets back into – Rutgers at least hurts Ohio State. Penn State at least hurts Ohio State. And you watch those games, and you feel like Ohio State is in control in both of those games, but you also feel like there are sustained stretches where Ohio State, especially defensively, just is not locked in on it and is just a little bit slow or a little bit reactive and winds up giving up some yards, winds up giving up some points. And so I think that's the other thing where if you are Indiana, if that happens, you've got to recognize that, and that's about taking your opportunities. You have got to, if you catch Ohio State on their heels for one reason or another defensively, you got to go for the throat whenever you have the chance to in this game, because that they have shown a bit of a soft underbelly at times. Now, of course, they've done it once they're in command of the offense or the game. So I'm probably being a little bit harsh on Ohio State when I say this. Both Rutgers and Penn State, by the time those teams start scoring their points, Ohio State is truly in command. But if you're Indiana, I think that does give you a little bit of hope that it doesn't feel like this is a smothering Ohio State defense like some of the ones we've seen in the past. And I think that maybe that just applies a little bit more broadly as well, that as talented as this team is, it's still not quite, maybe the best Ohio State we've seen in the last however many number of years.
So is it the secondary that you'd be watching maybe tomorrow is the maybe biggest weakness for the Buckeyes that Indiana could exploit? Because, when you look at a team that's, number 3 in the country, there just aren't that many weaknesses and there's so much talent across the board. It's hard to find anything to exploit.
Right. I mean, yeah, when you say exploit, I think that maybe, carries with it a connotation that you think that that's a weakness. I mean, like Michigan State secondary is a weakness right now, clearly. I think with Ohio State, you're just trying to pick a spot where maybe you feel like you can leverage the matchups. It's not one where you think, oh, they're weak there, we can hurt them there. It's more one where I think you've got to have the thought process of, well, we got to attack them somewhere. Where do we think we can create some of the most advantageous matchups? I think that's more what you're thinking. And the other thing too is I think you also just sort of say to yourself, we win with what got us here. It's okay to throw some wrinkles in. It's okay to do something offensively that you weren't doing 3 weeks ago. That's all perfectly fine. It's okay to tweak and adjust little things in the scheme or the game plan to attack Ohio State. But foundationally, if you're Indiana, you need to go with what got you here. And that's Michael Penix throwing the football on offense and creating the kind of havoc that leads to mistakes on defense.
Well, Zach, we'll get you out here in a couple of minutes. We've broken down the whole game, both sides of the ball. You mentioned a couple things that are going to be important tomorrow. What's the number one biggest key, though, you think that could lead to an IU upset?
I think it's just, the two things that, kind of one on each side of the ball. I think Michael Penix has to play well. And I don't just mean, efficient and doesn't turn it over. I mean, he's got to have something resembling a career day. And then defensively, they got to find a way to throw Justin Fields off a little bit. They've got to find a way to force some turnovers, even just some sacks, even just some penalties, things that set Ohio State back. Because what can happen against a team like Ohio State is, especially in a game like this, where you think about the sort of traditional, sort of ebb and flow of an upset bid. Part of what can happen sometimes in a game like that, and Indiana has been no stranger to this, is you shut off long enough to let the other team get in a rhythm. And all of a sudden, because they're just so good, that rhythm gets them 17 points in 7 minutes, and it goes from 21-20 Indiana to 37-21 Ohio State. And it feels like it was just that. It just happened seemingly in an instant. You've got to get Ohio State flustered. You've got to get them feeling early like they're not in the right frame of mind, or the game plan's not built right to beat this team. And I think that this defense is more than most is probably capable of that. But there's also a world in my mind where we get to Saturday and it just turns out Justin Fields is a generationally good quarterback and nobody's going to do that to him. And, it's going to be the college football playoff before we really see anybody really get to him. So you need some fortune. I don't think there's any doubt about that. You really do need Ohio State to come into this game a little bit rusty. But I will say, if you're talking about the elements of an upset like this one, those tend to be things, especially when no fans. Again, Ohio State unplanned week off last week, threw them out of their routine, threw them out of their rhythm. The kind of team that pulls off this upset is the one that capitalizes on mistakes and then gets a really, really good performance from its star quarterback. I I'm not saying that will happen. I'm just saying the profile Indiana brings into this game is one that fits, a pretty comfortable sort of narrative of how an underdog wins a game like this.
All right, Zach, I'm not going to let you go without making a prediction. So who wins tomorrow in Columbus?
I think Ohio State wins. I think, Indiana covers. I think there's points, 38-24, 38-28. I think the other thing Indiana's got to be, really prepared for is a fast start from Ohio State, because I think Ohio State can be rusty, but also just come out so motivated and excited to play that the first couple drives, they're really, really sharp. And then after that, once you kind of get off script and it comes down to how you adjust to what the coaches are throwing at you, it starts to kind of bog down a little bit. I think Indiana's got to be prepared for, hey, we might, a little bit like the Nebraska game last year, we might be facing 14-3, but there's not going to be any fans in the stands. I think if you're Indiana, you feel like we earned the right for this to be a big game. So, don't get overwhelmed if Ohio State has some success early. Just keep pushing, keep fighting, and see if you can't get them to make some of those mistakes, get them to make some of those, those costly errors, whether it's turnovers, sacks, whatever, that allow you to kind of just stay in touch and get to a point where there's 5 minutes left and you've got the ball and the game's tied or something close to that. So like I said, I'd pick an Ohio State win. I think it will be within the Vegas spread, in part because I just think that spread is so wide. But we'll see, obviously.
Well, Zach, great insight today. Really helped coming on and breaking down the game tomorrow. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That will do it today for our episode of Unpaid Interns. You can check out all of our Unpaid Interns episodes on our IU Sports Media YouTube page or listen wherever you get your podcast. We'll be back on Monday breaking down the big IU Ohio State game. But until then, have a great weekend. Enjoy the game, and we'll talk to you again